If you love spine-chilling horror stories, eerie mysteries, and unsettling tales to keep you up at night, you're in the right place. Every week I bring you a new story, perfect for those who enjoy a little terror before bed. If you like what you hear and want more, a like and a sub would mean the world to me. It helps the channel grow and keeps the horror coming. So sit back, turn off the lights, and let's get into tonight's story. Dr. Eric Langley had seen strange things in his career. Deer found torn apart in ways no predator should be capable of. Migration patterns that made no sense. Carcasses left untouched by scavengers. But this was something else. He leaned against the hood of his truck, staring at the dense tree line ahead. Towering pines swayed in the cold wind, their needles whispering secrets to one another. The mountains stretched in the distance, dark and brooding under the weight of an overcast sky. Locals call it Hollow Creek, Sheriff Tomlin had told him back at the station, a stocky man with tired eyes. Stay on the marked trails, Dr. Langley. People go missing up there. Eric had nodded, unfazed. He wasn't just a biologist. He was a tracker, a researcher, a man who had spent months in the wild studying predators. He had hiked Yellowstone, tracked wolves through Canada, even studied jaguars in the Amazon. He wasn't about to be scared off by some campfire stories. And yet, something about the way Tomlin said it, like a quiet warning rather than a threat, made his skin prickle. He slung his pack over his shoulders, double-checked his GPS, and stepped into the woods. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of his boots on damp earth. Then he saw the first sign, a footprint. It was massive, twice the size of his own boot, deep in the soil as if something impossibly heavy had passed through. No claw marks, no drag, just a clean, impossible print. Eric knelt, running his fingers along the edge, his breath fogged in the cool air. What the hell made this? A gust of wind stirred the trees, and for the first time he felt it. Something was watching him. Eric moved carefully, his boots pressing into the damp earth. The air here felt wrong, too still, too dense, as if the forest itself was waiting. He glanced at his GPS again. No signal. His brow furrowed. He hadn't gone deep enough for that. He tapped the screen, but the map was frozen, the blinking arrow refusing to move. A pit settled in his stomach. Keep moving. The trees thickened ahead, their skeletal limbs weaving together like prison bars. A scent clung to the air, damp moss, rotting wood, and something else, something foul. Then he saw it. At first it looked like jagged tree stumps rising from the undergrowth, but as he moved closer, details sharpened. Ruins, a town, or what was left of one. Half-collapsed cabins, their roofs caved in, walls leaning at odd angles. The wood was warped, blackened, not by fire, but by age. Doors gaped open like empty mouths, staring into nothing. Eric's breath slowed. He had studied abandoned settlements before, but this was different. There was no graffiti, no remnants of squatters, no signs of life. It was like the place had been scrubbed clean, erased. A sudden gust of wind hissed through the ruins, carrying a sound. Not quite a voice, not quite the wind. Low, faint, almost a whisper. Eric turned sharply, his pulse thudding. The trees beyond the ruins loomed taller than the rest, their trunks gnarled and ancient. Shadows curled between them, shifting as the branches swayed. Something moved. Not a deer, not a bear. Something taller. His breath hitched. He squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing. Just trees. Just silence. A trick of the light, he told himself. But as he turned back toward the ruins, he couldn't shake the feeling burrowing into his spine. The wind carried with it the scent of something decayed. Eric stood frozen for a long moment, eyes scanning the trees, the ruins, but finding nothing. He forced his legs to move, pushing away the gnawing unease that crept through him. The path ahead seemed clearer, though the trees loomed even thicker. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, to head to the town and find a way out. But his curiosity, his professional pride, held him there. As he moved deeper into the ruins, the air felt heavier, thicker. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and yet the forest itself remained eerily silent. Even the birds had disappeared. The only sound now was the crunch of his boots against brittle leaves. Then, a snap. A branch breaking. Eric froze. His heart pounded, blood rushing in his ears. He slowly turned his head, trying to trace the source of the sound. Nothing. Another snap, closer this time. It wasn't just a branch. It was something else, something heavier, moving with purpose. He took another cautious step, every muscle tense, as if the world itself was holding its breath. He'd spent years studying animals, tracking their movements, predicting their behavior. But this? Whatever was in these woods was different. The breeze picked up again, and Eric's breath misted in the cool air. Something rustled nearby. He snapped his head to the side, narrowing his eyes. For a fleeting second he thought he saw a shadow flicker between the trees, a silhouette, too tall and broad to belong to any animal he knew. It moved just beyond his line of sight, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. His pulse quickened. Was it following him? He took another step, heart hammering in his chest. It was no longer just the silence that unnerved him. It was the way the silence shifted, the way the air seemed to hold its breath in expectation. And then, just as quickly, the quiet returned. But this time, it was different. This time, it felt wrong. Eric shook off the creeping feeling and continued, each step heavier than the last, as if the forest was trying to pull him deeper. He found himself standing in the center of a clearing, nothing but tall grass and cracked stones. In the middle of the clearing was a large, twisted rock formation, ancient, perhaps even older than the ruins themselves. His eyes caught something, a gleam in the dirt. Eric knelt to inspect it, his hands brushing aside the leaves and dirt. A long, jagged piece of bone, too big for any animal he had ever studied. The edge was worn smooth, but the sheer size of it was unnatural. A growl rumbled in the distance. The air shifted again, colder this time. A deep, bone-chilling cold that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He stood slowly, hands shaking slightly, and turned back toward the trees. The growl came again, closer now, louder. And beneath it, a low, guttural whispering that seemed to carry on the wind, carrying his name. Eric's breath caught in his throat as the growl reverberated through the trees, low and ferocious. His heartbeat quickened, pounding in his chest. The hair on his arms stood on end, as the guttural sound stirred something primal deep within him, a warning, an instinct to flee. He didn't move. The whispering on the wind came again, carrying his name, barely audible but unmistakable. His eyes darted around, scanning the dense forest, but there was nothing. No shadow. No movement. No sign of whatever was causing the growl. The silence was suffocating, but Eric knew better than to trust the quiet. He'd been in enough dangerous places to understand that silence often meant one thing. He was being watched. A flicker of movement caught his eye. To his left, behind a cluster of trees, something shifted. Too fast, too large. His heart skipped a beat. He was no longer alone in this forest. The whispering rose again, louder now, unmistakable in its intent. A warning, a voice that sounded almost familiar, twisted and distant. He couldn't tell if it was the wind or something else, but it felt like it was coming from all around him. Eric's instinct screamed at him to run. Every fiber of his being told him to turn back. to retreat to the relative safety of the town. But the pull of the forest, the need to understand, held him in place. He took a slow, deliberate step backward, his eyes never leaving the trees. The growl came again, this time accompanied by the sound of something heavy shifting through the underbrush. It was close. Too close. Eric's breath hitched, and he turned sharply, sprinting toward the clearing. The path seemed longer now, the trees closing in on him as the forest itself seemed to pulse with life, dark and suffocating. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of twigs felt like a threat, every shadow a predator. But there was nothing visible, nothing tangible, just the sound of his own footfalls as they pounded against the earth, the cold air biting into his lungs. He stumbled, nearly losing his footing, but kept running, heart racing. The whispers came again, echoing in his mind. His name, Eric. He wasn't sure if they were real, or if he was losing his grip on reality, but one thing was certain. He wasn't alone. He burst into the clearing where his truck was parked, gasping for breath. His fingers fumbled with the keys, eyes darting to the tree line. But there was no sign of movement. No creature. But the air felt thicker here, heavier, as if it was pressing in on him from all sides. He slammed the truck door shut, turning the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered before roaring to life, the sound jarring in the unnatural stillness. He quickly shifted into reverse, his eyes still fixed on the trees, on the empty shadows lurking just beyond his sight. His truck lurched backward, tires spinning in the loose gravel as he sped toward the town. But no matter how fast he drove, no matter how far he went, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. The growls, the whispers, they seemed to trail behind him, carried by the wind, clawing at his sanity. The town looked different in the daylight. The sleepy mountain village, with its small shops and run-down houses, had an eerie sense of quiet about it, as if it were holding its breath. Eric parked his truck in front of the old diner, the only place in town still open. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but he hoped it was more than just silence. The door chimed as he entered, and the murmur of conversation died instantly. The few townsfolk seated at the counter looked up at him with strange, unreadable eyes. Eric's gaze swept the room, landing on the waitress behind the counter. Her weathered face was covered in a thin veil of worry. Her eyes lingered on him a little too long, a little too searching. He stepped forward. "I'm looking for information about the disappearances," he said, trying to sound casual, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "Animal killings, people vanishing." Her lips pressed together in a thin line. "What you heard? It's not what it seems." Eric felt his stomach tighten. There was something off in her tone, too cautious, too guarded. She glanced at the other patrons, all of whom were now watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. "Why don't you take a seat?" she suggested, gesturing toward an empty booth in the back. Eric hesitated. "Don't worry," she said, her voice low. "It's safer in here." The words felt like a warning more than an invitation. But Eric didn't want to push. He needed answers. Slowly, he slid into the booth, his gaze never leaving her. She poured him a cup of coffee, her hands steady but tense. "You're not the first to come looking. You won't be the last either." Eric's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" She leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woods. They take what they want. The disappearances, they're not random. There's a reason, but no one dares to talk about it." Eric leaned in, eyes narrowing. "What are you saying?" She hesitated, then glanced toward the door as though making sure no one was listening. The silent one, "It's real, and it's been hunting this town for years." Eric stiffened. He had heard the name, the strange whispers, the warnings, but hearing it out loud felt different. The weight of it settled in his chest like a stone. "What is it?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. The waitress looked down at the counter, her face pale. "It's a creature. Something ancient. The town has always known about it. We've been protecting ourselves, sacrificing those who don't belong." Eric's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, sacrificing?" She shook her head, as if unable to find the right words. "The disappearances, the people who go missing, they aren't taken by accident. They're sent into the woods to feed it, to keep it from coming for us." A chill crept up Eric's spine. "So you send people into the woods?" She nodded slowly, as if the weight of the truth had been suffocating her for years. "We have to. It's the only way to keep the silent one at bay." Eric's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. He felt the sting of betrayal, the gnawing sense that the town was not only hiding the truth, but actively leading him into danger. The waitress sighed, her eyes sad. "You should leave, before it's too late." Eric stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He couldn't stay here any longer, not with the air so thick with secrets. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, she spoke one last time, her voice a ghost of a warning. "It's already too late for you." The world outside the diner felt different now, charged with an unnerving energy. The air was thick, pressing against Eric as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for him to make his next move. Eric's mind raced, spinning with the waitress's words. Sacrifices, the silent one. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The town had known all along, and he had unwittingly walked straight into their trap. He needed to get out. His hands gripped the steering wheel as he drove away from the diner, the tires crunching over the gravel road. The town seemed to shrink behind him, swallowed by the dense forest that loomed ahead. But as he drove, the silence felt heavier, suffocating. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees like a warning. He wasn't alone. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered. Eric slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching to a halt. The truck jerked, and for a moment, everything went still. A figure stood at the edge of the road. Tall, unnaturally tall, with a dark silhouette that seemed to blur with the shadows of the trees. Its presence felt wrong, unnatural. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, his hands clammy on the wheel. He couldn't look away, his eyes fixed on the figure that was slowly, deliberately stepping toward him. The growl came again, this time not from the woods but from the figure itself. The sound was deep and guttural, vibrating in Eric's bones. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. And then, the figure was gone, vanished into the trees. Eric didn't wait. His foot hit the accelerator, and the truck shot forward, tearing down the road as fast as it would go. He didn't care about the speed limit, didn't care about anything except escaping whatever it was that had just appeared. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, but the road ahead was empty, until the truck slammed into something large and immovable. Eric was thrown forward, the air knocked from his lungs as the truck came to a sudden stop. He gasped, disoriented, but the world around him seemed to fade in and out. He stumbled out of the truck, his legs shaky beneath him. And that's when he saw it. The figure was standing in the road again. This time, it was closer. So close that Eric could make out the details. It was towering over him, its body cloaked in dark, matted fur. Its face, if it could be called a face, was a twisted mass of features, eyes too large and too dark, its mouth wide and jagged, like it had been carved into the shape of something bestial. It didn't move. It just watched him. Eric could feel its eyes on him, piercing into his soul. His breath quickened, his pulse racing. There was no escape. The growl came again, louder now, closer. Eric turned to run, but the figure was faster. It was in front of him in an instant, blocking his path. He stumbled backward, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no place to go, no way to fight. This was it. The silent one. The creature that had been stalking him. The one the town had been hiding from him all along. And now, it was his turn. Eric trudged deeper into the forest, his boots sinking into the damp earth with every step. The silence was absolute. No wind, no rustling leaves, no distant calls of birds. Only the steady pounding of his own heartbeat filled the void. He gripped the flare gun tighter, its cold metal biting into his palm. The trees around him stretched high and skeletal, their bare limbs reaching toward the sky like twisted fingers. Shadows pooled thick between the trunks, shifting with every uncertain step he took. He felt watched, an unshakable presence pressing in from all sides, unseen but undeniable. Then a sound, a single, deliberate knock echoed through the trees, hollow, deep. His breath hitched. Another knock followed, closer this time. His mind raced. Wood knocks, a warning, a challenge. He had read about them before, stories of something ancient that used them to communicate, or to hunt. A low growl rumbled through the night, vibrating the very air around him. He turned sharply, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing, just an oppressive blackness swallowing the path behind him. His fingers trembled as he raised the flare gun. His pulse thundered. Fire would scare it off. Light would drive it away. That was the theory, at least. Then, movement. Something massive lurked just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam, shifting between the trees. A shadow too tall, too broad, its breathing heavy and slow. It wasn't running. It wasn't hiding. It was waiting. Eric's throat tightened. The realization settled deep in his bones, chilling him to the core. He wasn't chasing it. It was leading him. Eric's hands trembled as he fumbled for the flare gun. The oppressive silence of the forest bore down on him, thick and suffocating. His breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse hammering in his ears. He could still hear the heavy footsteps circling just beyond the tree line, impossibly large, impossibly patient. Watching, waiting. He swallowed hard and raised the flare gun. His fingers felt numb from the cold sweat slicking his skin. This had to work. It had to. With a sharp crack, the flare shot into the sky, a burst of red light swallowing the darkness. For a brief moment, the forest was illuminated in flickering crimson. The trees stretched out like skeletal fingers, casting long, twisting shadows. And then, movement. Just beyond the flare's glow, something shifted. The towering silhouette was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, massive, hulking, wrong. The brief flash of light painted its outline in nightmare hues, matted fur, elongated limbs, and eyes that caught the light and burned with something ancient, something hungry. Eric staggered back, his chest tightening. The flare was supposed to scare it off, but instead, it called to it. A low, guttural sound rumbled through the trees, vibrating in Eric's bones. The thing was moving toward him now, no longer content to lurk in the shadows. The realization struck him like ice through his veins. The flare hadn't saved him. It had doomed him. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. Every breath felt like breathing in smoke. The forest closed in tighter, the weight of unseen eyes pressing against his skull. It was here, and it was coming. A branch snapped. Eric turned, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the dying embers of the flare. His heartbeat roared in his ears. The scent of earth and rot thickened in his nostrils. The air itself seemed to tremble, as if reality was fraying at the edges. Then, just behind him, breath, hot, damp, close. A massive shadow loomed over him, blocking out the last flickers of light. And then, the silent one reached for him. road stretched ahead, a winding scar through the dense pines of the Pacific Northwest. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, eyes scanning the thinning mist that clung to the treetops like something alive. Cole sat in the passenger seat, rifle resting across his lap, chewing on an unlit cigar. "Feels different out here," Cole muttered. "Too damn quiet." Jack grunted in agreement. The two had spent years tracking things that shouldn't exist, things that most people dismissed as folklore. But this job was different. 3 missing hikers, all in the last month, and each disappearance left behind only one clue: massive footprints leading into the deep woods. They reached their destination, a small clearing by a crumbling fire road. Jack killed the engine, and silence swallowed them whole. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing but the distant groan of the wind. Cole stepped out first, cocking his head. "You hear that?" Jack strained his ears. Nothing. "Exactly," Cole muttered. "Should be birds, bugs, something." They unloaded their packs. Thermal scopes, motion cameras, enough ammo to take down a bear. Jack checked his watch. Sunset was 3 hours away. They had to move fast. A mile into the woods they found the first sign. A tree, stripped of its bark, deep claw marks gouged into the raw wood. "That ain't a bear," Jack murmured. Cole knelt beside a massive footprint in the damp earth. Still fresh. Whatever made this, it's close. Jack placed a motion-triggered camera on a nearby trunk. "Let's set up camp. Keep an eye on the tree line. We're being watched." The feeling of unseen eyes was nothing new, but this time it was different. Heavier, more aware. As darkness crept through the forest, the wind carried something strange, a low, rhythmic knocking sound. Jack and Cole locked eyes. The sound came from all around them. "Wood knocks," Cole whispered. "It knows we're here." Jack exhaled slowly, hand tightening on his rifle. "Good. Then we know where to start." The knocking stopped, and silence fell once more. In that moment, Jack realized something chilling. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the night. Jack sat with his back to a tree, scanning the tree line through the flickering glow. Cole sat opposite him, reloading his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. "Whatever's out there," Cole muttered, "it's testing us." Jack nodded. They had hunted creatures before. Wendigos, skinwalkers, even a Jersey devil once. But this? This felt different. It wasn't just lurking, it was toying with them. A branch snapped in the distance. Jack raised a hand, signaling for silence. The fire hissed as a gust of wind swept through the clearing. Then something moved. Not a small rustle, but a heavy, deliberate step. Cole turned, rifle aimed toward the sound. "You see it?" Jack peered into the darkness through his thermal scope. Nothing but a shifting blur just outside the firelight's reach. "It's there, just watching." Another step, then another. The weight of the movement sent a shiver down Jack's spine. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't afraid of them. Then came the smell. A foul, musky odor, like wet fur and decay. Jack swallowed hard. He had smelled something like this once before, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. "Damn thing stinks," Cole whispered. The knocking sound returned, closer this time. 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Jack's blood ran cold. "It's signaling." Cole tightened his grip on his rifle. "Signaling what?" Before Jack could answer, something howled. Low, guttural, and impossibly deep. The sound rattled in his chest, vibrating through the ground beneath him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the forest fell silent again. Jack kept his rifle steady, scanning the black void between the trees. The fire's glow barely reached beyond their small clearing, and whatever was out there knew it. Cole exhaled slowly, adjusting his grip on his weapon. "That howl wasn't meant to scare us." Jack nodded. "It was calling something." They waited, listening, a distant shuffle. A heavy breath. Then silence again. Cole shifted slightly, angling toward the sound. We should go dark. Kill the fire. Jack hesitated. They needed the fire for warmth, but more importantly, for visibility. Still, he knew Cole was right. If this thing relied on sight, taking away its advantage might even the odds. Do it, Jack whispered. Cole grabbed a handful of dirt and smothered the flames. The clearing plunged into darkness. Jack activated his thermal scope, scanning the area. And then, he saw it. A massive shape loomed at the edge of the trees, crouched low. The heat signature was massive, humanoid but wrong. Too long-limbed. The head, too large. Cole tensed. Tell me you see it. I see it. Don't move. The creature inched forward, its movements unnatural, like it was learning how to walk. It let out a low, wheezing breath. Then, in one terrifying instant, it lunged. A blur of muscle and shadow barreled toward them. Jack fired first, the shot cracking through the night. Cole followed, his rounds tearing into the darkness. The thing screamed, not in pain, but in rage. Branches snapped as it retreated, disappearing into the trees as fast as it had appeared. Cole exhaled, shaking his head. That wasn't a warning. It was a test. Jack tightened his grip on his rifle. And now it knows we can fight back. The woods went silent again, but this time Jack didn't find it comforting, because something told him it wasn't running away. It was circling. The morning fog clung to the ground like a blanket, leaving dew-drenched grass in its wake. Jack and Cole moved carefully through the forest, alert to every crack of a branch, every snap of a twig. The tension from the night before hadn't lifted, but the silence was different now, heavier, almost expectant. Jack adjusted the straps on his pack, eyes scanning the darkened canopy overhead. He had learned early in his career to trust his instincts. Something was off. He could feel it in his bones. Let's head north, he suggested, motioning through the trees. North it is. Cole nodded, his voice steady. But Jack could hear the faint tremor in his tone. Both men had spent their lives in the woods, but this place felt different, like they weren't meant to be there. They had been hunting since they were boys, tracking animals, stalking prey, learning the land like second nature. Jack had started out young, his father, an experienced outdoorsman who taught him everything about survival. He'd grown up in the wilderness, spent more time in the woods than at home. But it wasn't just the animals that called to him. His father had shared tales of strange things lurking in the shadows of the forest, things that were part myth, part warning. It wasn't until Jack's first real encounter with something unexplainable that the stories took root in his mind. That was when he truly understood the darkness that could hide behind the trees. Cole had come into this life more by accident. He had been a ranger in Yellowstone, working to protect the park's wildlife, until he came across a trail he couldn't explain, a missing persons case that turned into something darker. His investigation had led him to creatures that defied logic, skinwalkers, wendigos, creatures of law that stalked the living. He had quit his ranger job soon after, realizing that the more he learned, the deeper the rabbit hole went. That was when Jack had found him. They'd formed an unlikely partnership, hunting down the things that no one believed in, but that both men knew were all too real. As the two pushed deeper into the forest, they stumbled upon the old cabin. It was a structure out of place, forgotten and overrun by time. The wood was weathered, paint peeling away like old skin. The roof had caved in on one side, and the door hung loosely from its hinges. Looks like someone's been here, Jack said, his voice low as he approached the door. Cole grunted in agreement, his gaze moving over the surroundings. This wasn't built for comfort. Jack stepped inside, rifle ready, scanning the dark corners of the cabin. His eyes flicked across the room. Bloodstains marked the floor, the faint outline of something, a body, having been dragged across it. The walls bore claw marks, long and jagged, as if something had tried to claw its way in. A journal lay open on the dusty table, its pages yellowed with age. Cole approached, picking up the journal. He flicked through it, the words fading with time, but one entry caught his attention. "It lets you think you have a chance," he read aloud. The words sent a chill down his spine. Jack exchanged a glance with Cole. "That's what we're dealing with. It wants us to think we have the upper hand." Cole nodded grimly. They had both known that the creature they were hunting had never been a typical animal. It had a mind, a cunning that went beyond instinct. They weren't just facing a predator. They were facing something far more dangerous. "Let's move," Jack said quietly. "It's still out there." But as they left the cabin, a new weight pressed on their shoulders. The realization that whatever hunted in these woods wasn't just a cryptid. It was something ancient, something that had watched them before and would continue to do so, even if they couldn't see it. The day dragged on, the light filtering weakly through the towering pines. Jack and Cole pushed on, knowing they couldn't afford to waste time. Every step felt calculated, each movement an attempt to stay one step ahead of whatever was stalking them. The journal entry kept circling in Jack's mind. "It lets you think you have a chance." The words gnawed at him, unsettling in their simplicity. Whatever they were hunting, it was more than just an apex predator. It had patience, it had strategy, and worst of all, it understood fear. They had spent hours tracing the massive footprints deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser with each step. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Even the birds had gone quiet. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. As dusk settled over them, Cole broke the silence. "You feel that?" Jack stopped, his eyes darting across the forest. There it was again. The oppressive weight of something unseen. The sound of the wind was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. "It's close," Jack whispered, barely audible. He reached for his rifle, fingers brushing the stock. Without warning, a distant cry cut through the air, a guttural, bone-chilling scream that reverberated through the trees. It wasn't animal, not in any way Jack had ever heard. The scream sounded like pain, twisted with hunger. Cole tensed beside him. "That's not normal. That's—" Before he could finish, a voice, deep and unmistakably their voices, floated through the trees, just out of sight. It was faint at first, a whisper in the wind, then clearer. "Jack, Cole, help me." The hairs on the back of Jack's neck stood on end. The voice was unmistakable. It was their own. Cole's eyes went wide, and he raised his rifle instinctively, scanning the shadows. "It's playing with us." The voice came again, closer this time, and this time it was laced with desperation. "Jack, Cole." "Don't listen to it," Jack growled, his grip tightening around the rifle. He was the one who had taught Cole how to survive in situations like this, how to stay calm, how to trust instinct over sound. But the voice was different now. It wasn't just calling, it was pleading. Is it him?" Cole asked, his voice shaking as he scanned the tree line. Jack didn't answer. Instead, he motioned for Cole to stay low. "Move, quiet." They crouched and moved, keeping low to the ground, staying within the cover of the trees. But as they moved, the ground began to tremble, a heavy thudding sound echoing through the woods. It wasn't the wind or a large animal. This was something else, something deliberate. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, his breath quickening as the noise grew louder, closer. He spun around just in time to see a massive shadow barreling toward them. Something fast, too fast. It was there, charging through the trees, an enormous shape that was all muscle and rage. The ground shook under its weight. "Move!" Jack screamed, pushing Cole out of the way. But it was too late. The creature's huge clawed hand shot out, snatching Jack by the leg, pulling him off his feet. He slammed into the ground, rifle flying from his grip. The force of the impact left him dazed, his vision blurring. Cole reacted without hesitation, his own rifle already leveled. He fired, the shot splitting the night, but the creature barely flinched. It dragged Jack toward the darkness, its grip like iron. The thing's hollow eyes locked onto him, a silent promise of something worse than death. "Jack!" Cole yelled, sprinting toward them. But before he could reach his friend, the creature let out a guttural growl, warning him away. Jack fought to free himself, slamming his fists into the creature's arm, but it only tightened its grip, pulling him deeper into the shadows. He could hear Cole's frantic shouts, but the forest swallowed them whole. Then, in the blink of an eye, the creature released him. Jack crashed to the ground, gasping for breath, his leg throbbing in pain. "Jack!" Cole's voice came from behind him, strained and desperate. Jack scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg. He spun around, rifle in hand, but the creature was gone, vanished into the woods like it had never been there. The two hunters stood there, panting, the weight of what had just happened settling in. The creature wasn't just hunting them, it was playing a game, and they were losing. "Get a grip," Jack said, his voice hoarse. He glanced around the clearing, eyes darting between the trees. "It's still out there." Cole nodded, sweat dripping down his face. "I'm not leaving you behind." "Then let's make sure it knows we're not going down easy." Jack's hand tightened around the rifle. It was time to turn the tables. But as they prepared, a whispering wind passed through the trees, carrying with it an eerie voice that made their blood run cold. It was calling them again. Only this time it was different. This time it wasn't their voices. It was Cole's. The woods were oppressive in their silence, broken only by the distant calls of unseen creatures. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as he scanned the area. His heart still raced from the close call, and he couldn't shake the sense that the creature was circling them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But something else gnawed at him, a horrible, creeping feeling that they weren't alone anymore. "Cole?" Jack whispered, his voice taut with tension. But when he turned, his stomach dropped. Cole was gone. The spot where his partner had been only moments before was empty, the ground undisturbed as if Cole had simply vanished into thin air. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He called his name again, louder this time, but only the trees answered. A knot of dread twisted in his gut, the feeling of being watched intensifying. "Cole!" Jack shouted, panic rising in his chest. Still nothing, only the whispers of the wind. For a long moment, Jack stood frozen, heart pounding. His mind raced. Was it the creature? Had it taken Cole? Or was this something worse? He tried to convince himself that Cole had just wandered off, maybe to check the perimeter, but deep down, he knew better. Number something had taken him. Jack's grip tightened around his rifle, his knuckles white. He had to act. If Cole was still alive, there was no time to waste. He couldn't afford to wait. His instincts as a hunter kicked in, and he moved quickly, retracing their steps, trying to think like the creature. What would it do? What was its next move? He couldn't hear the wind anymore. The forest felt too still, the silence so profound it pressed against his chest like a weight. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw it. Cole's rifle, discarded on the ground. But there was no sign of Cole himself. His heart dropped. He reached for the rifle, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. It had been snapped in half, the barrel bent and twisted as if it had been caught in something far stronger than any man or animal. Something far worse. Jack swallowed hard, forcing himself to stay calm. The creature had shown its hand. It knew he was coming for it. The question now was how to survive it. He moved on, scanning the forest, knowing that his time was running out. His eyes darted between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. Just more trees, more shadows. A sudden sound, sharp and clear, cut through the silence. A snap of a twig, then another. Too soft to be human, too deliberate to be animal. Jack turned, his heart racing. He couldn't hear Cole anymore. The whispers had stopped too. The air around him seemed to crackle, the tension thickening. Whatever was in the forest with him wasn't just hunting him, it was toying with him, just like it had with Cole. It lets you think you have a chance. Jack gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus. He couldn't let his mind wander. He had to find Cole, had to stop the creature. He had to survive. He crouched low, moving cautiously, but with purpose. His rifle was raised, the barrel steady as he crept through the brush. His every step was calculated, every move deliberate. And then, as he neared the clearing they had camped in earlier, he saw it. Cole was kneeling in the center of the clearing, his back to Jack. His movements were slow, unnatural, as if something were forcing him to move in a way that didn't make sense. His hands were raised, palms out, as though he were feeling his way through the darkness. "Cole?" Jack called, voice low but desperate. At the sound of his voice, Cole's head jerked up, his eyes wide and frantic. His face was pale, almost drained of color. And then Jack saw it, the unmistakable mark of something in his eyes, something not quite right. "No, no, no, no," Cole whispered, his voice strained, barely above a breath. "Cole, you're okay, it's me, Jack." Jack rushed toward him, his pulse racing. But Cole didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at Jack, his body stiff and rigid. And that's when Jack saw it, the creature's reflection in his eyes. It was standing behind him. Jack spun around just in time to see the massive figure emerge from the trees, impossibly tall, impossibly wide. Its hollow eyes were locked onto him, and its skin, if you could call it skin, looked stretched, almost translucent. It stepped forward, the ground beneath it cracking with each step. The air grew cold, the very essence of the forest warping around it. Cole didn't move. His hands hung limp at his sides. "Cole!" Jack shouted again, but his friend didn't respond. The creature's hollow eyes never left Jack as it took another step closer, its footfalls shaking the ground. Jack's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He was out of options, out of time. With a deep breath, Jack raised his rifle. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, the creature's voice, low and raspy, slithered through his mind. "You think you can escape?" The words were clear, but they didn't come from its mouth. They were in his head, in his very soul. Jack's hands shook, but he forced himself to focus. "Don't listen to it. Fight back." With a primal yell, Jack fired. The shot rang out through the clearing, the impact hitting the creature square in the chest. But it didn't stumble. It didn't even flinch. Instead, the creature tilted its head, as if amused. Then the world seemed to shift. The ground beneath him seemed to give way, the world tilting, spinning. Jack stumbled, his vision blurring as he tried to steady himself. And through the haze, he heard the creature's voice again, this time clearer, more ominous. "It's already too late." Jack fell to his knees, his mind racing. He couldn't tell if it was the creature's power, or if his exhaustion had finally caught up to him. Either way, the fight was far from over. But in that moment, Jack realized one terrifying truth. The creature was inside his mind. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled to regain his footing. His head felt heavy, the world around him spinning in an endless loop of confusion. The creature's words echoed through his skull, a constant whispering mantra that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. "It's already too late." But Jack didn't have time to contemplate its meaning. He had to survive. He couldn't let the creature drag him into its mind games. His survival instincts kicked in, and despite the overwhelming dizziness, he forced his body to move. The creature was still standing in front of him, towering, unyielding. Its hollow, empty eyes bore into him, and for a moment, Jack could feel his will to fight slipping away. The creature's presence was suffocating, like it was pulling him into its very essence, draining the life from him with every passing second. But then, a flash of light broke through the haze. A memory, a split-second vision of Cole. His friend's face, pale and twisted in terror, pleading for help. Cole's still out there. I'm not going to lose him too. Jack shook his head violently, forcing himself to snap out of the creature's trance. He pushed through the dizziness, focusing on the here and now. With a grunt, he regained his balance and staggered to his feet. His rifle was still in his hands, though his fingers were numb from the creature's influence. The creature hadn't moved. It just stood there, its empty gaze fixed on him. It was waiting. Jack's mind raced. What could he do? He'd never faced anything like this before. There was no protocol for something this wrong. It wasn't just physical. It was psychological, deeply rooted in the core of the forest itself. And yet, he knew one thing with certainty. The creature was playing with him, and he wasn't about to let it win. Jack aimed his rifle at the creature, his hands steady despite the tremor in his chest. He pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the creature's chest, but it didn't flinch. It didn't even seem to notice. The creature leaned forward, its hollow eyes widening, and Jack felt his legs tremble as it closed the distance. The air grew thick, charged with something that made Jack's skin crawl. You think you can fight me? The voice slithered into his mind again, the sound of its deep, hollow tone vibrating in his bones. Jack felt his stomach churn as the creature's presence pressed in on him from all sides. He was suffocating, drowning in the weight of its power. But Jack wasn't ready to give in. He refused. The rifle slipped from his hands, the weight of it too much as his fingers began to tingle with the sudden loss of strength. He stumbled back, struggling to breathe as the creature's voice wrapped around him. You cannot escape me, Hunter. You are mine now. The words echoed in his mind, but Jack pushed them out. He couldn't think about the creature's control. He had to focus on survival. His breath quickened as he pressed his back to the trunk of a massive pine. Sweat stung his eyes, but he couldn't wipe it away. His hands were too occupied, keeping his weapon trained on the surrounding woods. The rifle felt heavier by the second, like it was pulling him down into the ground, dragging him into the weight of inevitability. There were no more tricks left, no more surprises. If he was going to make it out alive, he had to end it now. And then, just as he thought he had a handle on the situation, the air shifted. Jack's vision blurred for a moment, and when it cleared, there was a figure standing at the edge of his sight, a tall, hulking silhouette moving between the trees. It was the creature, but it was different now, taller, more imposing, and the air itself seemed to ripple around it. It's toying with me. Jack's grip tightened on the rifle as he steadied himself. He could feel the creature's gaze on him, cutting through the dark. Its hollow, empty eyes were always watching, always waiting. It knew that Jack was a threat, but it wasn't going to kill him quickly. No, this was far worse. It wanted to drag him through the agony of uncertainty, to strip away his sanity piece by piece. Come on, Jack muttered, his voice rough with desperation. Let's finish this. With a guttural screech, the creature lunged. It moved faster than Jack could react. He fired, once, twice. The shots rang out through the woods, but the creature was already on him, its long arms reaching for him with bone-crushing speed. Jack barely had time to react, his rifle swinging wildly as he struggled to push the creature away. Its claws scraped against his chest, leaving deep, bloody gouges. The force of its weight sent Jack crashing to the ground, the world spinning as the creature loomed above him. For a moment, Jack was paralyzed by its presence. He could feel its hollow eyes boring into him, its cold breath on his skin. It was too much. The weight of it, the sheer malevolent force of its being, was overwhelming. But then Jack remembered Cole, his friend, his partner. He couldn't let this thing win, not after everything they had been through. With a sudden surge of strength, Jack kicked out with his legs, shoving the creature back just enough to give himself some space. His breath came in gasps, his chest burning with every movement. The creature hissed, an unsettling sound that vibrated in Jack's bones. It stepped back slightly, its massive form blocking out the moonlight above. For a moment, everything stood still. Man and monster, frozen in time. And then the creature spoke. "You cannot win." The words slithered through Jack's mind, filling him with a cold certainty. It was right. He couldn't win. This wasn't a fight he could win. Not against something so ancient, so full of rage and malice. But then Jack's eyes flicked to the ground beside him. His hand brushed over something rough, a jagged rock. It was small, but it could serve its purpose. Without hesitation, Jack grabbed the rock, holding it tightly in his palm. He didn't have a plan. He didn't have anything left. But this creature had underestimated him, and he wasn't going to die kneeling before it. The creature lunged again, and this time Jack was ready. He swung the rock with every ounce of strength he had left. It struck the creature's face with a sickening crack. For the briefest moment, the creature faltered, its hollow eyes blinking in confusion. It didn't hesitate this time. Jack took his chance. He scrambled to his feet, pulling out his remaining flare gun from his belt. With one swift motion, he aimed and fired, sending the flare careening toward the creature's chest. The explosion of light and heat was deafening. Jack shielded his eyes from the brightness as the creature screamed, its terrible, otherworldly wail filling the air. The force of the blast pushed the creature back, its massive form thrown into the trees. Jack couldn't hear it over the ringing in his ears, but he could see the smoke rising from where it had fallen. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the ground shook. A low, rumbling growl filled the air, and Jack's blood ran cold. It wasn't over. The creature wasn't dead, but Jack had done something. He had heard it. And in that moment, he knew that he wasn't finished. Neither was Cole. With his heart pounding in his chest, Jack turned toward the ridge, the flare gun still clenched in his hand. The fire that burned in him now wasn't just for survival. It was for vengeance, for everything the creature had taken, for Cole, and for whatever was left of the forest that wasn't yet consumed by the hollow stalker. "Where's Cole?" His mind screamed, but there was no answer. Then he remembered the rifle, the broken rifle he had found earlier. It had been snapped in half, a clear sign that whatever this creature was, it had strength beyond anything Jack had ever encountered. But there was something about that broken rifle that triggered a thought, a plan. Jack's eyes darted to the ground. He scanned the area, looking for anything that might give him an edge. That's when he saw it. The trees. If the creature couldn't be stopped by conventional means, then perhaps the environment itself could be used against it. He wasn't going to win in a straight-up fight, but if he could get it off balance, maybe, just maybe, he could outsmart it. With his heart pounding in his ears, Jack bolted toward the nearest tree, using its thick trunk to shield himself from the creature's unblinking gaze. He gripped the bark tightly, his muscles straining as he pulled himself up. His mind raced with plans. Every detail mattered now. The creature was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. It could be trapped. As Jack climbed higher, he heard the creature's slow, deliberate footfalls behind him. It was circling again, waiting for him to make the wrong move. He had to keep moving. He couldn't stop. Not now. Up in the canopy, Jack found a series of low-hanging branches. They could be used to his advantage. He could swing from tree to tree, leading the creature through the thick woods. But first, he needed to draw it in closer. With a deep breath, Jack let go of the tree and fell into a crouch, landing silently on the forest floor. He pulled the last of his gear from his pack, a flare gun. His fingers fumbled as he loaded it, but there was no time to hesitate. The creature's heavy breathing was growing louder, its presence suffocating. He aimed at the sky. One shot. Jack pulled the trigger, and the flare shot into the night. lighting up the forest with an eerie red glow. The creature froze, its hollow eyes locking onto the flare with an intensity that sent a chill through Jack's bones. Now he darted into the trees, moving faster than he ever had before. He couldn't hear the creature's pursuit, but he felt it, closer now, as if it had become part of the very air around him. Jack swung from branch to branch, forcing himself to keep going, keep moving, never looking back. And then, just as he reached a small ridge overlooking the clearing, Jack stopped. His breath came in heavy bursts as he crouched low, watching the creature emerge into the red glow of the flare. It looked up, its hollow eyes scanning the trees. It was now or never. Jack reached for his pack, pulling out the final weapon he had left, a makeshift Molotov cocktail. He had rigged it earlier, just in case. Now, the flames would be his salvation. With a quick motion, Jack hurled the bottle at the creature. The explosion was deafening. For a brief, terrifying moment, Jack thought he saw the creature's outline engulfed in flame. But then, just as quickly, the fire dissipated, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. Jack's heart raced as he scanned the clearing. The creature had vanished again, into the smoke or deeper into the woods. But Jack knew one thing for sure. It wasn't over. Not yet. It was still out there. And now, it was hunting him. Jack's pulse was still racing, his heart hammering in his chest like a war drum. The woods around him had grown unnervingly quiet again, but there was no comfort in the silence. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of a branch was a threat. The flare had burned out long ago, leaving the forest in darkness once more, but Jack's eyes were sharp, the adrenaline keeping him alert. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The makeshift Molotov had done something to the creature, but Jack wasn't foolish enough to think it was gone. Whatever this thing was, it was ancient, beyond anything he had ever faced, and it didn't die easily. Cole was still missing, his fate uncertain. The last thing Jack had heard from him was a struggle, a scream, and then silence. He'd tried to find him, but there had been no sign of his friend. No trace, no clue. Just the overwhelming sense that something had swallowed him whole. Jack's mind reeled, but he couldn't afford to let grief take hold. Not yet. Not until he had a fighting chance. Focus. His hand tightened around the rifle again, the stock slick with sweat. The air smelled of smoke, but beneath that was something else. A sour, rot-like scent, sharp and heavy. Jack's instincts screamed that the creature was close, moving through the trees just beyond his vision. He turned slowly, scanning the area. A flash of movement caught his eye, too quick to be human. He spun, raising his rifle to fire, but there was nothing there, just a flicker in the darkness. A low growl rumbled in the distance, and Jack's blood ran cold. It was here. They were the hunters, until they became the hunted. Deep in the Pacific Northwest, seasoned monster hunters Jack and Cole track a creature responsible for a string of disappearances. But as the nights grow longer and the forest grows quieter, they realize something chilling. It isn't running, it's watching, and it's waiting.